I am delighted to welcome Jonathan Pageau back on my show. We had him on last year talking about fairy tales. And today we're going to be talking about fairy tales and the music of the spheres and how we approach fairy tales with children. So thank you so much, Jonathan, and welcome to the show.
It's great to be back. I had a lot of fun last time.
Yeah, this is exciting to me because fairy tales are so important. And I've really appreciated how much you have put forth effort in making sure that fairy tales are told well. And your project with the beautiful books, the Snow White book is absolutely stunning and gorgeous. And my 3-year-old granddaughter loves it, and she'll sit through the whole reading over and over and over. It's because the pictures are so beautiful. But I've really appreciated the education you've given behind the work that you're doing. In particular, I want my listeners to understand that the interview we do today is going to be piggybacking on your Music of the Spheres talk that you did for the Great Hearts Conference a few years ago. And I will put the link in the show notes for that because I think it's an important talk, a very important talk. And so, what I'd like to do today is really dive into some of the deeper things that you talked about in that episode. Um, I kind of want to start off with our listeners hearing a very beautiful definition of fairy tales that I know you would agree with. And it's from J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, which is an essay that I think everybody should read. It's a wonderful, beautiful essay. And what J.R.R. Tolkien says is fairy stories are about fairy. That is, fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. So I just think that's a wonderful way of describing what fairy tales are. And what I'd like you to do is jump straight into your Music of the Spheres analogy and explain to my listeners how you define the music of the spheres and its role ontologically as it connects to fairy tales.
So the music of the spheres is an old, very, very old tradition, which is that as the as the planets move through the zodiac, there's an understanding that they make music, like that there's a pattern in the way that they move. And certain more materialist philosophers have tried to interpret it as, basically these spheres rubbing against each other and vibrating at a certain frequency. But ultimately, we can mostly understand it as the idea that the world lays itself out in these patterns. And when we look up in the heavens, what we're looking at is a clock, like a giant clock that is patterning our world. We don't tend to think of, when people look at their horoscope, we think it's kind of silly. But there is a way in which naturally the world above, that is the stars that move in the heavens, they pattern our world below. You wake up in the morning when the sun comes up, and you go to bed at night when the sun goes down and the moon comes up, and it waxes and it wanes. And the stars that appear in the heavens, they tell us when to reap and when to sow, and it gives us a sense. It gives us a patterning of the seasons, and so we do live by the pattern of the stars. There's no way around that. But let's say more akin to the idea of fairy tales, the way to understand that is that there are certain patterns of being that legislate, that form, that frame our behavior, and those are captured in the stories. And it's not wooed, it's nothing magical about it. You can understand it in an almost very Darwinian way if you want. You can imagine that humans have a capacity for attention, and that capacity for attention is ordered by the things that we care about as humans, things that make us thrive, make us survive, that kind of light a light in us, this fire that we have inside us, and that people started to tell stories about that would capture that attention, that would capture the attention. And you can imagine over generations and generations, centuries and millennia, these stories being retold and retold and remembered some stories being forgotten, some stories being remembered and then retold, ultimately refined, because the versions that were the closest to what humans care about would end up being retold, even if you don't know why. You don't even have to understand the process. You just have to recognize the process as being this normal process of transmission and remembering that has been going through the millennia. And so we can almost know with confidence that the old stories, the ones that have been retold until today, the fairy tales, the myths, similar to the stories in the Bible, the gospel stories, they have in them a secret, like a secret of what humans care about, a secret of attention. So that's also a way of understanding the music of the spheres, which is that they contain patterns that legislate or that form our experience and our behavior. And so they're not moral tales in this simple sense. They're not like, do this, don't do that. Sometimes you do find that in fairy tales. But at a deeper level, they're more like a tuning fork. They're more like a kind of tuning fork that makes us remember and re-participate in the most fundamental patterns of human care.
Oh, I love that you're calling it a tuning fork. I think that's great to tie fairy tales to that idea of a tuning fork. And I think that one of the dangers of fairy tales being read in school, which I think they should be, is that teachers feel like they have to unpack it for the children, or that they have to teach a lesson on it. Let's
Yeah.
create this moral lesson around this fairy tale, and they end up spoon feeding these ideas to the children, and that's something that because this is an education podcast, that I feel very passionately concerned about, because I know that your message about fairy tales is that that's not what we should do. That fairy tales aren't some kind of metaphor or moral lesson, but they are so much more than that. So much more that we just need to let the fairy tale be what it is. Um, which kind of would take me into this idea of, how do the fairy tales develop our imagination? I know that's something you've talked a lot about, and how that is important, that the fairy tales are developing like a sacramental or a moral imagination in us. Why is that important?
Well, what's important in the fairy tale is, in some ways, it is when I talk about it being a tuning fork, you could understand the tuning fork as being a set of relationships, like a set of different relationships that are fit in a hierarchical pattern, right? So you have, like, let's say you have the last son, let's say, that pattern in the story, right? The idea of the youngest son. So the youngest son appears over and over in these different stories and appears in different ways, and what it's doing is it's placing things in their place, and it's helping you understand, because we function through analogy. That's how we understand things. We compare them, we contrast them, and you don't have to be smart, you don't have to actually understand it. It just happens. And so when we enter into these stories, what it does is that it basically forms the structures of your thinking. It's creating categories in your mind, in the child's mind, and not just the child, adults as well. And then it is filling those places with images. And so you can think about, let's say, the image of the forest. And so you have the forest. What's in the forest? In the forest, there's a treasure. In the forest, there's our strange creatures, dwarves. It's dangerous. There's a hunter. There are, you can see, like, as you create these images of what's in the forest, right? What's in the castle? Well, in the castle, there's a tower, there's the king, but there's also the danger of, like, tyranny. There's all of these things, but you don't explain it. You just create these analogies in the child's mind, and then that becomes the tuning fork. It's basically a structure of being that the children can exist in, that will make sense of the world. And it's weird because if you look at the details of fairy tales, some of them are so ridiculous. Like, why would anybody care? Like, think about, I don't know, the cat, Puss in Boots. It's like, how is this story? Are you telling this story to our children? It's like the weirdest story, that the cat and dresses like a human, and then it tricks these people, and you're like, what is happening? Like, why is it that my children like this story? Or Jack and the Beanstalk. It's the most ridiculous thing. Like, why would a story about going up on a beanstalk, counting giants, like, it has nothing to do with the hard facts of reality. But
Right.
that's when you realize that, in fact, the analogies that are in the stories are something like, you could call them like extreme analogies or extreme images of things that the child has to deal with every day, and is forming again their behavior. That and it really this really can help us understand even ancient mythology, ancient stories, why they look the way they do, why they tend towards kind of excessive, extreme images, because they are, how can I say this? They are the limit cases that that are able to form us. They're like the most extreme. So, what's a bad person? Well, a bad person is someone that is dangerous to me and is kind of attacking me. Well, okay, well, how bad could they be? Well, another thing that's bad is like an animal that could devour me. And so, oh, so you have a big person that now is kind of hairy like an animal and maybe has pointy teeth. And so you create this image of the monster. And obviously, you'll never encounter that in the world. But humans are amazing. Humans are able to take out of that and to parse out what it is that they need to be able to recognize when they encounter someone who's a danger to them.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, one of the things that you're bringing up is this idea of being. And could you expand on that a little bit? I think I when you did the episode or the presentation with Great Hearts, you said something about the grammar of being. Do you remember talking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that? Can you expand on what that means?
So the best way to understand, it's hard to talk about being because being is just what is, and so it's difficult to talk about that. But what you have to realize is that what is not arbitrary, right? It doesn't appear to us as arbitrary. So you can take this in the sense of, Martin Heidegger is very good at helping us understand this, which is that you have this experience of the world, that the world kind of presents itself to you, right? You see things, you encounter things, and those are organized in a kind of hierarchy of being. That is, you have to structure the world in front of you in a pattern, because there's too much, or there's too much stuff. Everything that you have identities for has a million details on it. Everything you're looking at, there's a million things next to it that you're not looking at. The world is this huge, world that is completely saturated with possible identities, right? So, it's like, if I when I talk about things, I always talk about them with purpose. And that is the structure of being. The structure of being is that we organize the world through care, right? It's the things that we care about that will tell us what it is that you need to worry about, or what it is that you need to pay attention to. So when I walk outside of my house, there's something that I call grass. Grass is not one thing. Grass is like 100 different species of things. It's all this different stuff. But because it plays a certain function, I'm able to say it's one thing, it's grass. Now, if there's poison ivy in the grass, all of a sudden that poison ivy will pop out in my identity formation, and I'll pull it out of the grass and I'll say, oh, that's not grass. That's poison ivy. And that's really dangerous for you. So it doesn't mean that it's all subjective and it's all relative, but what it means is that the world is organized through care, and that organization ultimately is what we would create what we could call the hierarchy of beings, or even the order of the stars, or the hierarchy of the gods, or the hierarchy of the angels. All of these types of images are like the ultimate representation of how the world is ordered through this capacity to care.
Okay. So, how do fairy tales really help children, or actually even adults, enter into that?
Well, because they offer, first of all, the best versions of it, because they have been refined over millennia, and also they do it in a way that is not very immediate. Like, they use images that transcend time and border. The idea that we talk about, a simple example, like the idea that we talk about kings and princesses and princes. This looks like it's such an antiquated idea that is ridiculous. But the idea of a prince, like, we have this word principality, right? Or a principle, that is the top of something, the head of something, and so the princes and the princesses in stories, that's what they are. They are types of humans that are patterning other behaviors. That's why those are so important in stories. And so that's just one example, but there are plenty of examples of the images in fairy tales that in some ways, like for example, the image of the forest. Like that image of the forest, you don't even need to have lived near a forest to kind of understand that it's the outside. If you live in Manhattan, the forest is an alleyway. The forest is that the place behind the building that's kind of chaotic and not totally, don't really know what it's for. And so, but the forest is the best image for it. But then when the child brings that into their being, they will be able to associate the analogies. Like they'll know that a dark alleyway is akin to a forest. They won't never be able to tell you that, but that is what is happening in their mind, and they'll be able to recognize, for example, the idea of beauty that is aimed towards truth or beauty that is aimed towards deception. These are really important categories for a human to be able to interact with.
I agree. In fact, you just said recognizing truth. So I'm going to read a quote that I think is really important to this topic that Charlotte Mason says in one of her volumes. And it really has a lot to do with how we approach fairy tales, which I really want to talk about because it's really important how we're approaching them with students. She says the duty of a child is to acquire knowledge. This duty alone motivates. Their natural desire for knowledge springs them into action. The conscience can be guided and strengthened without even raising a question of why something was right or wrong. Our faith tells us what is morally right and wrong and convicts us to recognize truth. And I think what she's saying here is that we have that natural tuning fork, if you will, that tells us what's right and wrong and helps us to recognize truth. Children, we have an innate ability to do that because we were created in the image of God. So we don't necessarily need somebody stepping in there and telling us what something means. If you believe a child is fully created in the image of God, and they are carrying within them the full capacity and ability to be people, fully human, right? Then they're going to understand these things. That tuning fork, as you, if you will, is already going to be tuned correctly and rightly because of them being created in the image of God. I mean, I know that you agree with that, and
Mhm.
I just think that, um, yeah, there's so much truth that we can recognize in a ridiculous fairy tale.
Of
But we
course.
don't have to unpack all of the meaning of it to recognize it.
Yeah, you mean like for children? Of course not. I think that, there's no point in explaining a fairy tale to a child, you know, because the child doesn't, first of all, doesn't care about your explanation. The child just, you could ruin the story if you tried to
Well,
explain it to a child. You
that's why kids hate
make it
school.
boring. Yeah, no, you make it
That's
boring.
why they hate school. They
That's
hate
right.
school because they're just being the Charlie Brown wah 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 wah
Yeah,
wah
yeah.
wah wah the teacher, you know.
No, the story, in some ways, the best way to tell a fairy tale is to celebrate. That's the best way to think
I
about it.
love that.
Is that to make the child see that this is a beautiful, precious story. Like this is a story that comes down to us from, from once upon a time. Like this is something very precious, and we tell the story in a way that is, like, if we tell it with a sense of wonder and awe, that is the most important, because that's when the child will enter into that care and into that attention. But there's no point in explaining the story. Like I mean, some of the fairy tales that are the most moralistic, you could say, or have the most morals in them, they're so obvious that, like, we don't need to tell them. And the ones that are very subtle and very complex and sometimes deal with darker aspects of the human psyche, then you also don't need to explain them, and you probably shouldn't explain them. You should just let them sit in the child's mind, because the fairy tale, usually what it has in it, it has the natural playing out of the consequences of things. And so, that's enough of a lesson. And so, if, for example, if you see the consequences of actions, just that is enough for the child to understand what is being rewarded, what is being punished, and then what is the tone of those things happening. That's a much better way to teach the moral of the story, is to just let it play out and let the child see that's why, like, the old fairy tales, they often had very radical consequences for the bad characters, like some that we would never read today. What is the end of Snow White? The witch has burning shoes, like she's burning iron shoes under her feet, and so she dances until she dies, and it's like, that's a horrible image. But we don't necessarily have to go there, but we have to understand that the consequence in the story is how the child learns, not telling them, giving them the moral.
Yeah, and I love that you said that we want to celebrate fairy tales, and it immediately makes me think about how children actually want to dress up in the
Yeah.
costumes of, and I often tell teachers, "Hey, when you're reading a fairy tale or a poem, make it tea time. Have tea, have a
Mm.
tea party. It is to celebrate. They need to have that. There's a beauty to that experience, that tangible experience that they can attach with the story, like tea time or dressing up. I was at one school and that's what she did. She had I think it was tea time on Fridays, and they she had a box in the classroom of like they could wear boas and hats
Mm.
and ties for the boys and
Yeah,
things. And so when she would read the fairy tale, they would put these little costumes on. So I think that's really beautiful that you said that they should be celebrated. And I actually got to see a teacher doing it in that way.
that's awesome.
I think that
But
is right. Go ahead.
let me just say something. There's a tendency, we see it, like there was a tendency for a long time to make, for example, children's books excessively, very, very accessible to the children, right? So you put them out, you put them on the table in their bedroom, and so they can throw them around, rip them or do whatever. And I think that there's a fun aspect to that, which is not wrong, but there's also a way in which you want to make some of these stories actually very precious. And
I
so
think so.
that's been the approach in our fairy tale books. We've made them very high quality objects with, like, cloth binding and foiling and all of this, debossed imagery on the cover, and thick pages with beautiful printing, so that it's more like this little treasure that you put up in the bookcase, and the child says, "Dad, can we read that?" And it's like, "Oh, maybe not today, maybe tomorrow." And then the child just really wants to see it. So this idea of making something precious, a little bit out of reach, a little bit something that has value, is also a way to help the child enter into that sense of celebration.
I think that's beautiful. I agree with you 100% on that. And I always tell schools that I work with, if you can afford to buy the beautiful copy and not the paperback, buy the beautiful copy, have the teacher read it and show the children, and teaching the children how to handle books. I think
Yeah.
books are very important. And I think that it's not good to let children throw books around. I'm always trying to teach my grandchildren, we don't throw that on the floor. We put that away when we're done with it, right? Because
Yeah.
books are, we take advantage of how much we have nowadays, but books are precious and should be handled carefully.
Mm.
Um, Another thing that I heard you say something about, and I forgive me, I'm not remembering exactly. It was a few minutes ago. You said something about the endings of stories. Oh, it was the witch, the Snow White, the ending of the witch, the feet burning. You said,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, actually, interestingly, I was rereading my Tolkien on fairy stories, and he mentioned something in there about how fairy stories are good for adults and children. And but
Hmm.
one of the things he said in there was that um children love justice.
Yeah.
They want to see that. They want to see the bad person getting what they deserve. But adults actually prefer mercy.
Yeah.
So it's harder for an adult to actually hear that. And so,
Because the adults are raising the kids, and they're like, they have to show mercy to their children too.
well, and they think, I don't want my child to know there's that much bad in the world. But you know what? They're finding out when they play with another kid and that other kid is biting them or hitting them with
Yeah.
the toy. They know there's bad stuff going on in the
Yeah. Yeah.
world
Yeah.
and they want justice, right? And so I think, and I hear often Christian homeschool moms will ask, well, are fairy tales okay and good to read? Because, they don't want to expose their children to this. What would you say to that mom?
Well, I would say the one thing, there are maybe things that to us are beyond the pale at this point, and that's okay. Like maybe some things are excessive, and we might want to tone down a few things, but in general, the fairy tale is actually a way for the child to enter into this. Like, I know that this is hard, but I think one of the greatest things that fairy tale does is something like trauma preparation. It's like preparing children for trauma. That's why the fairy tales have to do, so many of them have to do with puberty and the change that happens, like the childhood ending and the entering into the adult world, because that is experienced often as a kind of trauma. And so the fairy tales are there to help you find images and tags in your psyche to hook these experiences on. and it's completely unconscious. But like a good example would be right now I'm writing a version of Little Red Riding Hood that we're going to publish this year, and and it's Little Red Riding Hood, and and it's really Little Red Riding Hood, and the wolf is like putting on makeup and dressing up as the grandmother, and and kind of prowling on the child, and it's like, okay, that imagery is scary for people, and it's like, yeah, but also this is things that your children need to learn about. It's like you actually don't want to tell your children don't talk to strangers. What you want in the child is to have a little bell, a little intuition of what is off about a stranger that I shouldn't talk to them, of what it is about the stranger that I have to be careful of, and what it is about the stranger that I can be open and engaging with. Because you don't want your children scared of everybody they don't know. You want them to find that balance, but you need to initiate them into that world, or else you won't then you're not preparing them. And so stories like that are, I think there are some even like darker stories that are some that were you can imagine how useful they are for children, like the story of we have I don't know what it's called in English. It's called Podan in French. It's this young girl whose father wants to marry her, and then she has to like put on this donkey suit and like run away and hide from her father. And you think, man, that's dark stuff. But you know children have to understand what is the proper order of relationships. Like we have someone has to teach them. It's like, that your father, your cousin, your uncle, that he can't be your husband. And you have to know that when you're quite young, because you might find yourself in situations where you have to think about that and deal with that. So these are hard things to do, and these are hard things to talk about. And fairy tales are a way to help the child enter into the world without you're not ruining their innocence, because they don't know what they're dealing with yet. It's like a puzzle of images that they're putting together, that when they come into situations when they're faced with some difficulty, then they'll have a map on which to tag their experiences onto.
Hmm. Hmm. It's actually developing discernment.
Of course.
Yeah, that's really good. Another thing that you mentioned that I want to kind of go back into from the talk that you gave for Great Hearts on the music of the spheres and how they relate to fairy tales. You mentioned over and over about attention, memory, and transition. Can you talk a little bit about that concept? And I really liked it. I want my listeners to hear this.
Yeah, so it's related to what we talked about before, right? And so the idea is that humans have a hierarchy of things that they care about, and
Mhm.
that hierarchy of the things they care about is a hierarchy of attention, things that are important to you.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that happens is your memory, the way it works for you to remember something, you in some ways have to contract them together, right? And you create lines of memory. Like, let's say, you could say, my relationship with my mother. Like, my relationship with my mother is something that happens all a bunch of other stuff happening at the same time. I'm going to school, I'm going to bed, I'm hanging out with my friends. But there is a story in my existence, which is, my experience with my mother. And that has to be contracted in order for it to be remembered. It has to be strung together in the important salient parts so that I remember it. That's how stories work. That's how stories function. And that's why we actually like stories, is because, let's say, you or I, we have our love story. We have a story of love in our life. It could be love lost, it could be a wonderful, beautiful story, tragedy, whatever, but we have this thing that we care about, which is like a love story. But like I said, it happens over your whole life. But when you see someone who's able to take the salient elements of a love story and put them in like a 1 hour and a half movie, that's like hyper attention. You're able to completely focus, because it's like it's teaching you, it's showing you what the story is, and it's giving you examples of the story so that you can compare it to your own, so that you can integrate it and giving you a key to understanding your life. And so that's why some stories get transmitted, because they do exactly that, because they do it in the best way. And so you could be a story about how authority functions, right? A lot of the fairy tales are about the advantages and problems of authority. And so that's something I have to deal with all the time, right? With my boss, with my father, with the let's say this the representatives of my church or the state. And so I have these stories that are together. But when I watch a movie or I hear a story where that is brought together and stringed together in a something that I can digest, then I care. And then I want to tell that story. So I transmit it. So that's what I mean. So it's basically attention, right?
Mhm.
Memory, in the sense that to remember it, I have to string things together and create a story. And then if it's a good one, then I'll transmit it to the next generation. I want to tell it, or versions of it. And that's how we have our whole, all the tropes, all our story tropes, all our, all of the archetypes. That's what they are, basically, right? They are these structures of being, these structures that are encoded in attention and memory, and so ultimately in images and stories.
Mm. Okay, so the reason I was really, um, I guess, enamored with this idea of attention, memory, and transmission, um, was because it made me start to think about how we approach a fairy tale with our students in
Hmm.
the classroom. And one of the, I think, most important pedagogical practices in classical education is the art of narration, and that students need to be narrating back what they have just read.
Yeah.
More so than discussing it or having a list of comprehension questions, they need to. So, what narration does is it helps them to attend well, to listen well, to pay attention, and narration must be done with stories that are well told. Like if you're not telling a story well, or it's just information out of a textbook, you don't, it shouldn't be narrated.
Yeah.
But narration is when you're hearing a story and you're telling it back, and that story is capturing your attention. And when you know you have to tell it back, it's really harnessing the power of attention. And then what that's doing is when the student is telling it back, it's cementing it to their memory,
Oh yeah.
and they're having to categorize it in their mind, and like what happened first, and then what happened, and oh, what happened, and what and then when you're doing this with your students and you're asking them to narrate and asking other kids, oh, what do you remember, uh were there any details that you want to share, then what's happening is the students are kind of, through the narration, they're hearing the story again, but in the own words of their peers. They're all kind of hearing it again, and then that's the transmission that is making it go in and really helping the students digest the story. And so I think, when I heard you talk about that idea of attention, memory, and transmission, I said, oh, that's narration. That
Yeah.
really the way we teach a fairy tale is through reading and narrating.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think your
That's it.
insight is wonderful. Not only that, but I think that the best thing you can do with a child is get to a point where you ask them to tell the story. So it's like, you say,
That's what narrating
"Oh
is.
yeah." I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
that's
You're asking them
amazing.
to tell it back.
And
Tell it.
you
Yeah.
say, and to do it like in a certain amount of time, you say, say
Yes.
it in a certain
Yes.
amount of time so that
Yeah.
you actually you force them to be able to string together the essential elements in the story to kind of reduce things. That's really important because like if you have children, everybody has noticed that young children, sometimes you'll ask them to tell a story, and what they do is they just ramble. They basically put events next to each other, and they just start putting events next to each other, but there's no sense of beginning or end. There's no sense of kind of dramatic transformation. There's no sense of you know of of how why you would care about the relationship between these different elements. And that just means that they still are I mean, they're still developing their mind. They're still developing
Hmm.
the capacity to synthesize and to see how things actually connect in a way that matters. Like when a child isn't able to differentiate between a secondary detail in a story and a main narrative element. I mean, these training a child to be able to see that is training them for everything. And that's
I
why
think
Einstein said, read fairy tales to your kids, because he understood that creating the categories of
yes.
mind and the categories of patterning and what goes together and what is it essential, what is a detail, that is training your child for everything.
Exactly. Well, that's my hill to die on in classical education is how important narration is. I mean, narration is the most important pedagogy in a class, period. Like you read the things, you tell the students, narrate back, tell me. And it's amazing because you see the children understanding and the light bulbs coming on when they're telling it back. And when they're narrating and they're getting into sort of, they've got beginner, intermediate, advanced stages of narration, but the more they narrate, the more information they're remembering, that over the course of, say, 2 years of narrating. So if they start narrating in first grade, by the time they're in third grade, they've got this database of knowledge
Yeah.
that they can make so many connections to. And so they're when they're narrating another story, they're like, "Oh, and that reminds me of this and that story." And that's when you start seeing the kids really actually learning because
Yeah.
they've been narrating and telling back. And yeah, you're right. It is the absolute most important way for children to learn. They have to be making those connections and making those connections go deeper and deeper and richer to where it's actually they're understanding what's going on. They're seeing the
Yeah. Yeah.
symbolism. They're seeing the connections that are
Yeah, and
happening.
that's a way when I would my kids, what I would do, we talked about explaining the fairy tales. Like that, I would never explain the fairy tales. But one of the things I would do, especially as they started getting older, is I would ask them when we're reading a fairy tale, I would ask them to pay attention and then to try to notice places where you've seen this before. And so it's like you're reading Snow White and then she falls asleep and you're like, where is that? Where have you seen that before? It's like, oh, is that Sleeping Beauty is kind of like that, right? She falls asleep, she wakes up, and then you're like, well, and then they see the story, they remember it, and you start to make the connections. Like, and that has been really useful. We used to do that too. Like what we would do is we'd read the fairy tales forever, and then we started watching movies together. And then when we watch movies together, I would say, try to see if you can pick up fairy tale stuff in the movies. Like if you could pick up certain things, and they would be like, oh, they fall in the water. Why are these movies, all these movies where people like fall in water and kind of come down into the water and then come out? It's like, oh yeah, these are story, these are patterns that we see in all of these stories, like whether it's in the Bible or whether it's in these ancient myths. And so they start to pick it up, and then you don't have to explain it to them because they just basically start to see there's a coherence to the context in which you would show certain images, and
Hmm.
that coherence is training you. Like it's training you as to what the categories of being are, what the levels of care are, and what it is that matters, and what's dangerous, and what's a threat. All of these things are just you're just being trained to recognize that.
Hmm. Hmm. Hi, guys. I just want to interrupt for a second to let you know, especially if you're new to this podcast, that Beautiful Teaching is my company, and we are a team of professional educators, and we produce this podcast. Collectively, we are experts in the liberal arts tradition for both classroom instruction as well as homeschooling families. We have lots of classes that we offer every spring and fall, and we have a few more courses left to enroll for this spring. And in the next week, I'll be teaching a class called Cultivating the Imagination, approaching fairy tales, fables, and moral lessons. So if you're listening to this episode, you might be interested in that little session. It's only a 2 hour class, and we will be practicing reading together and talking about fairy tales. And so I'm excited about that class and would love for you to subscribe to my newsletter. My website is beautifulteaching.com. And we have some amazing classes coming this fall, some surprises, a big, huge conference we're going to be doing online in October. So subscribe to our newsletter at beautifulteaching.com. And to see our course listings, you can get to there from my website, or you can go to beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. That's beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. So we have two different websites. One is my main website, and the other one is where we enroll for the basically webinars. So hopefully I'll see you there. Thanks for listening to the show. Okay, so Jonathan, we've kind of talked a lot about this idea of narrating, especially that's important, I think, for K-5 or K through 8. But for high school, do you have any ideas for what would be a good way for teachers to approach fairy tales with high school students? Because I think they're just as important for high schoolers.
Yeah, I think with high schoolers, what an interesting thing you've got is you've got kids that are now their mind is opening up, and so they have these stories in them. They have these fairy tales, and so now being a little more deliberate about the fairy tale is a good time. You can go through the story with the teenager again, and then be a little more deliberate about them comparing that story to other stories. For example, asking them to find places in media, in movies, or in whatever they're reading at their age that is connected to the fairy tale, a pattern, like I mentioned, this idea of going down into water, or the idea of of the king or the prince, or all these different types of patterns that you find getting lost in the woods. Like there's all kinds of patterns, and having the child now start to see them more deliberately, and then you can already start to ask them what it is that they think this refers to, or what it is that they can apply it to in the world today.
I love that. Or even Bible stories, how the fairy tale
Yeah.
might connect to a Bible story. This is a great idea for a teacher to have their students even writing a paper on if they need a paper for writing class. Yeah. And I even think Socratic seminars would be a really great addition to if the teacher can have three really power packed questions that they would throw out for the kids in his circle to talk about would be really good too.
And it's with the fun thing too is that the teenagers, not all of them, but some of them will start to think that now they're subtle, now they're reading these novels now, and so they don't. This fairy tale stuff is for kids, but to be able to kind of awaken them again to the fairy tale and say, "Oh, you thought this was just a little kid story. Now let's start to unpack it. Like let's say, for example, to show the relationship between the story of Snow White and puberty. Like you don't say that to a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, but if you're 15, then maybe you can understand like the idea of becoming beautiful, and then all of a sudden entering into a world of competition, of
Mm,
turning 13 and being taller than all the boys, and all these boys are like little dwarves that you don't aren't attracted to. It's like all of these things are in the Snow White story. That's not all Snow White is about, but that it's part of this Snow White story. And other of the fairy tales have a deeper, more adult themes in them that now, as a
mhm.
teenager, you can start to see without becoming cynical, but seeing that
Right.
it also encompasses this in the story.
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed with leading seminars is often you don't even have to have the question be very leading. It could just be something like, do you see any pattern in this story that you can relate to as a teenager? And just throw that out, and you've
Yeah,
got
yeah,
10
yeah.
kids, and they're going to start talking about stuff. They're going to bring it up. You don't even have to say anything about the idea of beauty. They're going to bring it up. It's going to
Mm,
happen. And they're smart. The kids know, and they want to be able to, share their ideas. They want a safe classroom where they can talk about those things in a very safe atmosphere. So it's a real art for a teacher to do Socratic seminars, but it's a
yeah,
real
yeah.
important part of school, especially classical. And if a teacher listening doesn't know how to do seminars, then they ought to talk to their headmaster because they probably need to have some training on how to do seminars. One of the things I want classical schools to do is have everybody reading Homer, teachers, and then
Yeah.
in their staff meetings once a week, they have one teacher who's really really good at leading seminar lead a seminar weekly in the staff meeting so that all the other teachers who don't know how to do seminar can experience seminar, and then they can go back and do it with their fairy tales in their classroom.
Yeah, that sounds great.
One of the other things that I thought was interesting that you shared that was a pretty bold statement, and I would like my listeners to hear about this and maybe have you expand a little more even than you did on your Great Hearts talk, um, is you said that fairy tales are the closest type of story to the Bible,
Yeah.
scripture. Can you explain that?
Well, there, for the same reason, like that scripture is something that's really important. Like we tend to think that scripture is important in an arbitrary way because God gave it to us. Like God basically gave us these stories. This is God's word, therefore they're important. But they're important for other reason, which is that God gave them to us because they are the best stories. They are the stories that encapsulate the most reality in them. And but the difficulty that we have is that they're actually difficult of approach. Some of them, because they don't have what we tend to think. How can I say this? They don't unpack things. And so in Bible stories, for example, there's no internal state, doesn't describe internal states, it doesn't describe what the person is thinking, what they're planning. None of that is described. It just describes events. Like here, this happened, this happened, this happened. And in those stories, like I said, is really the key to reality. Like these stories are astounding. um, Now, one of the things the fairy tales do is that they contain the same patterns, but they're like once removed, so they're easier of
Mm,
access. They use images that are more fantastical and kind of more imaginative, um, and so we tend to think that they mean something. One of the problems with the Bible stories is that we're so reduced that we see that the story is like, it's like a mother and a son, and the son is jealous, or blah blah blah, and so we're like, well, that's just what happened, because it doesn't use categories that are kind of imaginative. We struggle, or people struggle to see the pattern. But if I say, she was pricked by the spindle and then she fell asleep and she basically died, and you're thinking, well, that doesn't happen. Like, doesn't happen to anyone. So why is that in the story? And so there's a sense in which, it's like, oh, a talking donkey, or a talking cat, or like making gold out of straw. You're like, well, this must mean something. Even like, it's so weird and so strange that you think it must mean something. And so you're forced to pay attention to the analogies in a way that's maybe a little more forced,
Hmm.
and that it helps you then, hopefully, if you do it enough, it is a way into the Bible stories, because the fairy tales talk about are the same things that the Bible story talks about.
What are some patterns that you have seen that are similar?
So let's take a simple example, the easiest one. You'd say, so, Snow White eats an apple and she falls asleep and she dies. And you think, well, I've seen that before, right? Haven't I? And so what's the connection, right? And so it's very odd, because in that story, it has to do with the idea of, if you remember the story, especially the Grimm version, the queen, it says that Snow White is the most beautiful of all, right? She's the most beautiful in the land. And then the queen is jealous. She chases her out. But then she goes and she's trying to give her things that would increase her beauty, right? Because she goes and she gives her a comb, like a beautiful comb to put in her hair, and then she gives her a beautiful corset to put around her. And you think, well, why is she giving her things that would make her more beautiful? Isn't she already the most beautiful thing in the world? So what's
Mhm.
happening? And then you realize that it has to do with knowledge. It's the issue of knowledge. Like, she's trying to make her aware of her beauty. She's trying to make her care, like, in an external sense, about her beauty. It's just like the difference between someone who is just beautiful and someone who spends, half an hour in the morning making themselves beautiful. That's a different type of awareness. One is deliberately conscious of beauty. The other one is just beautiful in a radiant way. And so the queen is actually trying to make her into her. She's trying to
Mhm.
transform Snow White into the queen, because the queen is weaponizing beauty. The queen knows that, right? So you think, okay, what's the relationship between that and the fall in the garden? And it's exactly what it is. In the garden, God creates Adam and Eve and says he makes them in the image of God. It says it straight right there in the text. It literally says that he made them like God. And so then the serpent comes and he said, hey, if you eat this fruit, you'll become like God. And so
Right.
they're like, yeah, well, yeah, I want that. I want that. I want that thing. And then they eat the fruit, and that causes them to die, because the self reflection and the self consciousness, or this kind of arrogant trying to grasp something for yourself, right? That is what brings you to die. And so you can see that the two stories, they really have the same pattern, right? It's just that they're applied differently, and they're not exactly the same, but they have that same thing. And so you can see that there's so many versions of that, where, let's say, Jacob has this ladder that goes to heaven, and he climbs up. He sees the angels, and the angels go up and down the ladder. So we have a version of that. We have a Jacob, and he also goes up a ladder and goes into heaven. Now, there are differences between one and the other. They're not the same, but they're revealing similar patterns of being and how the world works.
Oh, that's good. No, that's really good. When you were talking, I immediately started thinking about Till We Have Faces and,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Oriole and Psyche, and how Psyche knew she was beautiful, but she never tried to seek it to get
yeah,
more.
yeah.
She was so different and so beautiful that she laid herself down and gave us a really good example of the opposite of what Eve did. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't even seen that before, but I mean, I love Till We Have Faces, and I watched your episode on that, and I've read it several times, and oh man, it gets me every time. At the end, I just bawl and bawl. It's so beautiful
Mm,
because it just kind of real. The part that really hits me on Till We Have Faces is when Oriole is standing in judgment, she's standing there and this tribunal is all watching her and she's naked, right?
Mm,
And she's putting forth her argument. And then at the end, she realizes, wow, I was just ugly. Like everything I just said was totally wrong. Like it's just this beautiful moment of realizing the need for repentance, I guess,
mm.
would be. And then realizing what Psyche had done for her is just after that is just so incredible. I don't know, for some reason when you were sharing that about, I had never made the connection to Snow White with Till We Have
With Adam
Faces.
and Eve.
But yeah, with Adam and
Oh,
Eve,
with Till We Have Faces. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, but I'm starting to kind of see something there. So maybe
Yeah, well,
yeah.
for sure, the you can think about the Snow White story. You can think it one aspect of it. Obviously, these stories are very subtle and complex, but one of the things about Snow White has to do with the problem of knowledge of beauty. Think
Hmm.
about it. The queen looks at herself in a mirror, and she's constantly trying to evaluate her beauty or have her beauty be evaluated. Whereas Snow White she is innocent. She's beautiful, and she doesn't understand the consequences of that, and that's why she's surprised. She doesn't see it coming. She's also too naive. She doesn't see it coming when the witch basically chases her out because she's too beautiful. She has to learn. Like she also has to learn to become aware of beauty in a way that won't kill her if you think about it. And the answer in the story of Snow White is that it's beauty in service of love. I mean, that's what it is. It's
Mm.
basically she's beautiful, but because it ends up that she is now married to the prince and she's gonna have a family and children, then her beauty is in service of something more, something higher. But the
Right.
whole story is about her trying to figure out what that is. What is she what is she doing?
Yeah,
Like what's
that's
the point?
interesting. It's almost like, and I don't know if inversion is the right word, but with Till We Have Faces, there's almost an inversion of that because Oriole is ugly and
Hmm.
Psyche is beautiful, but Psyche wants she doesn't even really care about the fact that she's beautiful at
Yeah.
all. Like she doesn't even have any care of that at all. But Oriole really cares about the fact that she's ugly.
Yeah, that's why she ultimately veils herself because she's too conscious of beauty in the negative
Yeah.
sense.
Yes, I don't know if I mean, it's very different than the Snow White and the Adam and Eve, but there's some kind of inversion going on there. I'm gonna have to read into that more. Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I haven't thought of of how to compare it to Snow White, but there's definitely the
I'm seeing
idea.
some kind of pattern, Jonathan, but I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, well, there is in some ways definitely in her case there's a sense that she's jealous, of her
Yeah.
sister,
Hmm.
and that she doesn't. How can I say that? That she knows she has a glimmer of what her sister is going is has access to, but she doesn't want to accept it, and then and therefore she closes herself off. She closes herself off to the vision that she has. She closes herself off because she kind of trades. She uses power to kind of hide the fact that she wishes she was beautiful, and she becomes a kind of cold, veiled tyrant or whatever, something like that.
But there's so many layers until
Of
we have
course.
faces that
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like there's lots of patterns and layers in that story. Um, well, I would like to just to reiterate to especially our parents and teachers who are listening, who have this mm, angst within them that they feel like we got to talk about the moral of this. What's the moral of the fairy tale? What did you learn from the fairy tale? Who is the good person? Who is the bad person? Let's have a conversation about it. I want to read a few things from George MacDonald's wonderful essay, which I will also link in the show notes, called The Fantastic Imagination. It is not a long essay, but George MacDonald, the way he says things is so beautiful. And it's, I think, a summarizing of what Jonathan is trying to say here. So he says, in discussing fairy tales, he says, suppose my child ask me what the fairy tale means. What am I to say? He says, if you do not know what it means, what is easier than to say so? If you do see a meaning in it, there it is for you to give him. A genuine work of art must mean many things. The truer its art, the more things it will mean. If my drawing, on the other hand, is so far from being a work of art that it needs a sign, "This is a horse," written under it, what can it
That's
what can it
like,
matter that neither you nor your child should know what it means? It is there not so much to convey a meaning as to wake a meaning. If it do not even wake an interest, throw it aside. A meaning may be there, but it is not for you. If again you do not know a horse when you see it, the name written under it will not serve you much. At all events, the business of the painter is not to teach zoology. And so I love he's basically saying we don't need to talk about what the meaning is. It's there.
yeah, well,
It's
he says, I think he said if you see a meaning, you can kind of, but I
yeah,
mean, I would
talk
say
about it.
that you always have to be attentive to the fact that the story will be larger than your meaning. When a
Right.
child asks you what does the story mean, and you tell them, there's also a kind of weird arrogance, which is you think you know what that story means. Now, do you? That
True.
story has been told for 10,000 years, by generation after generation, and maybe I'm exaggerating with the 10,000, but like it's been said for at least 1,000, at least. And so you probably don't know what it means, and you could spend the rest of your life like trying to figure that out. But you can hint. I think there's okay to hint and say you can ask questions. I like asking questions to the kids a little bit. It's like why you can not questions that will trap them, but something like why did this character do this? Do you think?
Or what
Like
did you notice?
yeah, yeah, exactly. What
What
did you
did you
notice? What
notice in the story? What
Yeah.
was interesting? What did you wonder? What questions did you have about it?
Yeah,
That's
those are
kind of
good
interesting. I
questions.
think they're great questions. And yeah, like with Till We Have Faces back again, like, yeah, there's lots of layers of meaning because it's a great work of art. So, there's so many layers of meaning. And I remember reading a wonderful book. I think it's called Walking on Water or something like that by oh, the lady who wrote Wrinkle in Time, Madeline L'Engle. Madeline L'Engle. And her book, I think it's called Walking on Water. And it's kind of her own story as an artist, as an author of what it
Hmm.
is like to be an author. And one of the things she talks about in there is how even us authors don't even realize all the meaning that's
Yeah,
going on.
exactly.
It's like the Holy Spirit is generating more than what we even know we're writing. And she goes, I sometimes go back and read what I wrote. And I said, oh, what was I trying to say there? I don't even know what I was meaning there, right?
Mm.
I'm sure that as an artist, Jonathan, you've kind of had that experience with
Yeah, of
finding,
course, because the thing is that meaning doesn't actually come from you.
right.
Like it just doesn't. So when you're saying something meaningful, you're participating in a meaning pattern that already exists. Because if it didn't, nobody would care about it. And so
Right.
I think that that's why when artists often feel like the stories don't come from them, because if you're attentive to that, this idea you hear artists say like I received it, the story came to me. It just and so the idea that the artist would know what it means. There's not necessarily, and because they can, let's say, perceive these relationships that are beautiful and coherent and that are interesting, doesn't mean that they know why. And none of us might completely know why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking of symphonies too. Like we all hear something different when we hear a symphony, and it means something different probably than what the composer even knew they were writing.
Yeah, but then it gets back to the deeper question, which is that the reason for the story is not so much to is not so much for you to understand it in your mind, but it's
Mhm.
for you to resonate with it, you could say, for it to kind of embed itself into your experience so that it becomes a part of that tuning fork, which is attuning you to how the world functions. And it's helping you live your life. Like it's just giving you path to take or path not to take, a sense of what does what in the world, and that's way more important than understanding it.
I agree. That's wonderful. I love that. I really love the tuning fork idea here. This is good. Um, how can our listeners find more about your fairy tale projects and what do you have out there now? I mean, Snow White was your first one. What's going on
Yeah,
now?
so we publish. So if people go to the symbolicworld.com and you click on the story, you'll see all of the books that we've published. So the first book we published was Snow White and the Widow Queen, and now we published a few months ago our Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack and the Fallen Giants. And so this spring we're going to have a version of Rapunzel. then the Valiant Little Tailor in the fall, like a bit before Christmas. But ultimately, we have 8 fairy tales that are in a kind of story arc that they are actually going to start to bleed into each other. So one of the things I wanted to do is that process that I mentioned of helping children see the connections and kind of see the relationships. I wanted to do that in the stories and do it in a way that that the child will recognize, oh, this character is the same as the other one, or this story, and do it a little more explicitly so that it creates that sense of kind of like what you see in people who have these Easter eggs in movies, but not just Easter eggs in the random sense, but really things that bring insight to the child and to the adult about what the story's about.
Hmm. And so do you have a store in there we can click and buy?
Yeah, so we would go on the store. There's the fairy tale. There's also for older kids, we have a series called God's Dog, which is a graphic novel series, which is a kind of fantastical retelling of the story of Saint Christopher with Saint George and like the dragon and the Leviathan and giants. It's kind of like an epic story, but set in the legend of Saint Christopher. So that's what we have for now. But we're going to keep adding. Like I said, we're doing Little Red Riding Hood, which is going to be outside of the series, and we're going to keep adding more and more of these. I just think that it's such a time. Children's literature. I hate to say this blankly, but it's so hard to find beautiful stories that are celebratory but that are subtle and have the richness that you want for your kids. It's hard to find that today. So it's okay to read the old books.
Yes.
I think it's important, but we also need to be part of that transmission. So we need to also be recapturing these and retelling them, and that's what we want to do.
I love that. And I don't want any of my listeners using any of the Disney versions in their classrooms or homes. they they're not good, and they're cartoons, and they're not beautiful. They're definitely, like, we want to teach our children that what they should care about, ordering their affections, what matters is beauty. And Jonathan's books are absolutely beautiful, and I'm very excited about this project. I'm looking forward to getting some more copies of your books. So I hope our listeners will too. Thank you, Jonathan. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you as well. This was great.